Normally, life point gain cards are terrible, but if you happen to be playing a deck that regularly gets into high life point values, what cards can you play that actually take advantage of having high life points? That's the question we hope to answer with today's video. And at number 10, we have Child's Play. This is a continuous spell card which has the effect to gain 300 life points each time your opponent summons a monster. And if you have 10,000 or more life points, your monsters cannot be destroyed by battle. Now, there aren't really generic spell or trap cards in the game that make it so all your monsters cannot be destroyed by battle, as they're generally tied to very specific archetypes or conditions or just a single monster. And this one falls squarely into the conditions category of needing 2,000 or more life points than normal, which its first effect can help you get to after your opponent summons 7 monsters though, which means you're probably not going to get the effect off if you're letting your opponent summon 7 times on top of you. Now, there are situations in which this card's battle protection would be incredibly valuable, like if you're playing a stun deck and you want to make sure your little barrier statues aren't run over in battle. In fact, if Child's Play condition was only at 8,000 life points, it might actually see competitive play, just to give you an idea of how good that effect actually is. However, at 10,000, it's basically a gimmick, which is why you've probably never heard of this card, and why it's a great card to lead off this list with. And at number 9, we have Battle Royale Mode Joining. This is a continuous spell card which has the effect where every time you take damage during your opponent's turn, you get to special summon any level 4 or lower monster from your hand or deck, but then you lose 2,000 life points afterwards. So this is basically a full stop search of any level 4 or lower monster in your deck, which I might remind you, procs every time you take damage during your opponent's turn, and is not once per turn at all. This sounds amazing, being able to get out any low-level monsters from your deck every time you take any kind of damage, all at the cost of 2,000 life points each. And this is exactly how it works. However, there's obviously a little caveat to this. It also works on your opponent every time you deal damage to your opponent during your turn. However, if you have no plans on ever attacking your opponent, like you're playing Runic or something, then this card basically only benefits you. Additionally, it has another good effect, where in order to activate this card, you have to target a face-up effect monster, where the first 2 times it would be destroyed by battle each turn, it's not. So you can use this on one of your floodgates in order to make sure it stays alive, and then use its other effect to special summon more floodgates from your deck if they happen to get rid of it. However, if they do manage to destroy the monster with the battle protection on it, they gain 2,000 life points. But if you want to gain 2,000 life points for yourself, you can target one of your opponent's monsters and then just destroy it by battle 3 times in order to get rid of it, and you'll be rewarded with 2,000 life points. So everything about this card is really good for decks that might want to gain life points, because they're generally only good in stall decks, especially since it can search out your other floodgates directly from the deck, or a Sacred Crane if you just want to draw a card. The only reason this card is so low on this list is specifically because the effect works on both players. So it might actually end up screwing you over if you're trying to push for game and your opponent keeps summoning monsters from the deck in order to block your attacks. And the fact it's really hard to trigger the effect yourself, as you can only summon monsters from your deck during your opponent's turn. And at number 8, we have Solemn Scolding. This is a counter trap card which can be used to stop basically anything your opponent tries to do. You can negate spells, traps, monster effects, and even the summons of monsters, all at the cost of 3,000 life points and having no other face-down spells or traps. Honestly, it's the restriction where you can't have other set spells and traps which prevents this card from seeing more competitive play. But even with a very expensive cost of 3,000 life points, it's still worth it because a full-on Omni Negate that's completely generic is just worth the high life point cost. Although this one kind of cheats on the list a little bit because the effect is so good it just straight up sees competitive play normally as a tech option. But it's also good in decks that have lots of life points, because a mere 3,000 isn't going to set you back very far. And like I've talked about earlier, it works very well with floodgates because they're all face-up cards, and if this is your lone back row, it's probably going to protect them from something like a Harpy's Feather Duster. Honestly, floodgates and life point gain is probably the only way to actually pull it off. So a lot of these earlier cards are just combos with floodgates pretty much. And at number 7, we have Mechlord Emperor Grinnell. This card can be special summoned from your hand if one of your face-up monsters is destroyed by a card effect and sent to the graveyard. And this card has the effect where it gains attack and defense equal to half your life points. Additionally, it has some other effects where it can absorb synchro monsters and gain their attack, but that's rarely relevant. The main reason for including this card is because if you have ridiculous amounts of life points, this is a very easy to summon monster that can gain a whole bunch of attack points based on that. There are a handful of other cards in the game which gain attack based on having more life points than your opponent, like Mars, Neo-Parshath, and Ancient Sacred Wyvern. But they all specifically require you to have another card on the field in order to gain the extra attack, like the Sanctuary in the Sky in the case of Neo Parshath and Mars, or just our hard to summon synchro monsters like Ancient Sacred Wyvern, which specifically requires a light tuner monster as one of its materials. Out of all the monsters that gain attack based on having a high amount of life point value, Mechlord Emperor Grinnell is the only one that's actually easy to summon, and doesn't have any other restrictions on gaining the attack. If simply one of your monsters is destroyed by a card effect, it comes out from your hand, and then if you have 10,000 life points, it will have 5,000 attack. And you don't need to have the Sanctuary of the Sky out on the field, and you don't need to run a cumbersome light tuner monster. And at number 6, we have Dark Snake Syndrome. This is a card which has the effect where both players take 200 effect damage during each of your standby phases, which is doubled on each following standby phase. So after 6 turns, this card will deal 12,600 points of damage, which will usually result in a tie. That is, unless you have a ton of life points, in which case it's just on off for 6 turns until the card deals 12,600 damage to your opponent, which is actually 2 turns faster than using Wave Motion Cannon, and almost as fast as trying to win with the effective Destiny board. And with Dark Snake Syndrome, you don't have to protect 5 other cards. But with Wave Motion Cannon, you don't have to increase your life points, which is usually why it's the preferred method for stall burn decks. Because the reason Dark Snake Syndrome hasn't really seen competitive play is specifically because it deals more than 8,000 damage to yourself as well as your opponent. And there's no way to prevent this other than stopping the damage with a card effect, or having more life points than your opponent, which is the whole point of this list. And at number 5, we have Gale Dogra. This is a level 2 monster which has the effect where you can pay 3,000 life points in order to send a monster from your extra deck to the graveyard. An important thing to note is that the effect is not once per turn. Now, there are a ton of cards in the game nowadays which have effects that are activated immediately upon being sent from the extra deck to the graveyard. And also a ton more Fallen of Albaz cards which activate during the end phase to give you advantage. So, baseline, Gale Dogra can be used to pop a card with Natis, search a ritual card with Herald of the Arclight, draw a card with Garura, or siege your graveyard with future pops thanks to the Fossil Fusion cards and Wind Pegasus. So, if you just use this for the Albaz advantage, you can gain a ton of cards during the end phase. But if you don't run any of the Albaz cards, you still have the option to gain advantage with Garura, put Wind Pegasus in the graveyard to deter your opponent from destroying your cards, or even go into the Shadow Engine by sending App Cologne to the grave to search out Schism in order to go into Window on the next turn. Or if you're playing a ritual deck, you can use it in order to search out 3 ritual spells or monsters of any variety from the archetype, which is just an amazing amount of search power that one card can give you. The only problem with Gale Dogra is that you can only use the effect twice normally, and it's kind of unsearchable outside of some gimmicky sprite combos. But it did see competitive play because just sending 2 cards to the grave is worth it to try to get it to the field. And if you have a ton of life points, you can gain even more advantage. And at number 4, we have number 35, Ravenous Tarantula. This is a generic rank 10 monster which has the effect where all monsters you control gain attack and defense equal to the difference in your life points with your opponents. They can also inflict 600 burn damage to your opponent each time they spell summon a monster, and you can detach material to destroy all of your opponent's monsters who have less attack than this card's. Now, at the number 7 spot on this list, we had Mechlord Emperor Grinnell because it was an easy to bring out monster that could gain attack for having a high amount of life points. But Tarantula is able to give the extra attack for having a high amount of life points to itself and all your other monsters. So if you have a huge life point lead over your opponent, this card can turn even a normal summon Ash into an 8,000 beater. And the card is rather easy to bring out with the new Mother Spider Splitter combo. So it's not like it's even locked behind an exclusive deck, since the Mother Spider combo can be used in pretty much any deck that has the extra deck space. Although outside of the Mother Splitter combo, it is pretty hard to bring out, unless you're running a whole bunch of easily summonable level 10 monsters, which is not really the easiest level to special summon outside of Eldritch and Trains. But with its power, it's the ultimate boss monster of a life point gain deck, turning all of your other monsters into boss monsters alongside it. And at number 3, we have Ancient Leaf. This card simply has the effect where if you have more than 9,000 life points, you can pay 2,000 life points in order to draw 2 cards. Now, I'm sure most people who saw this video probably assumed Ancient Leaf would appear somewhere, because this is the card everybody talks about being broken if they ever make a life point gain archetype too consistent. Because you only need to have 1,000 more life points than your starting total in order to have this card live. But if you do, you won't be able to use subsequent copies because then you go down to 7,000. Normally, the 2,000 life point cost would be a huge deal, but since you need to have a whole bunch of life points in order to use it anyway, that part is kind of negligible outside of just allowing you to chain multiple copies in your hand too easily. But if you have a ton of life points at all times because you're running some kind of life point gain deck, then every copy of Ancient Leaf is basically a pot of greed. a card that's currently banned because it's just too good at allowing you to dig through your deck to get more cards. And if you start a game with more than 8,000 life points, like in say a tag duel, Ancient Leaf is just a really good card for being a +1 that doesn't really negatively impact you, like a Pot of Desires or Pot of Extravagance might. And at number 2, we have the Aroma cards. The Aroma Mages are an archetype of monsters and spells and traps, which all have effects that gain life points and have effects that activate when you gain life points. However, we're going to be focusing specifically on 3 cards, those being Aroma Mage Jasmine, Aroma Safari Sweet Marjoram, and Dried Winds. And specifically these 3 cards because they all have really good effects that activate if you just gain any amount of life points once per turn. With Jasmine, if you gain any life points, you get to draw 1 card, and the effect is only a soft once per turn. So if you have 3 copies of Jasmine on your side of the field, each time you gain life points on yours and your opponent's turn, you'll draw 3 cards, which is probably the best way to gain advantage off of having more life points, because drawing cards is just one of the most premium effects. Which is why we had Ancient Leaf at the previous spot, which simply drew you 2 cards for having a lot of life points. Then we have Dried Winds, which is a continuous trap, where the first time you gain life points during your turn, you get to destroy 1 face-up monster your opponent controls. Unfortunately, the effect is mandatory, so you don't get to choose which proc of life points will destroy your opponent's card, unless you're able to choose how you gain your life points. So, if you have Dried Winds on the field alongside Child's Play, the first time your opponent summons a monster, for example, you'll be able to destroy that monster. And being able to actually impact the field by getting life points is pretty important, which is why we also have Sweet Marjoram on here, because she has the same effect, except it allows you to destroy any card instead of just your opponent's monsters when you gain life points. Aroma Seraphie Sweet Marjoram is a level 6 synchro monster with generic materials, which can actually search out Dried Winds on its synchro summon, and when your life points are higher than your opponent's, it can't be targeted by card effects. Going into a generic level 6 synchro is not the easiest thing in the world, but if your only goal is to get out this card, you can simply run the Assault Mode engine to get it out with a single summon of Cyreflector off of an emergency teleport, or by using the Punk engine. Now, there are other Aroma Mage cards which have effects that proc when you gain life points, like Rosemary, which allows you to negate a face-up card effect after it gains life points, but none of them are as useful as Jasmine, Marjoram, and Dried Winds, since they all impact the game just so much more directly and for more advantage than all the others. And their effects don't require their archetype to work, and can just be used with any deck that gains life points. However, Dried Winds is the only one that doesn't require you to use a normal summon or other resources to bring out, so that's the only one that's easily slotted into a life point gain deck to gain advantage. And finally, at number 1, we have Backup Squad. This is a continuous spell which has the effect where each time you take 1,000 points of damage, you get to draw 1 card for every 1,000 points of damage you took. This card is not once per turn, and that's very important because let's use Lava Golem as an example. If you give your opponent Lava Golem and then they attack you directly for 3,000 points of damage, you'll be able to draw 3 cards off of it because you draw 1 for every 1,000 points of damage you take. Then, if you have 2 other copies of Backup Squad out, you also draw 3 cards for every copy of Backup Squad. And then, say your opponent also attacks with a Kaiju, the weakest one that only has 2,200 attack, in which case you'll be able to draw 2 cards from your Backup Squad, even though you've already drawn 3 from Lava Golem. Because it procs every time you take damage, the card is just an insane advantage machine. So much so that if you're running a deck that has a lot of life points, and you have Backup Squad on the field, your opponent will probably just never attack, because the amount of advantage you gain from Backup Squad would just be ludicrous. It's one of the few cards in the game that can rival Max C in the amounts of cards you draw in a turn, and it's only limited by the fact that you kind of need a lot of life points for it to work, and it's really easy to destroy in the back row if your opponent just wants to not have to deal with it. But the fact that this is such a priority target to be destroyed just proves how good it is, and why it's easily the best card to use if you have a bunch of life points, because nothing draws you more cards than Backup Squad. Alright, and that's the list. If you have any other ideas for videos similar to this, and I mean videos that go over a whole bunch of cards that are only useful in a very specific kind of scenario or deck, I would love to hear about them down in the comments below.